time Abraham Lincoln became president, there had been a great many changes in our country. Men had invented many new things, and one of those inventions was an engine to pull trains. Oh, it was very different from the train engines of today. It had a tall black smokestack, and it could not go much more than 20 miles an hour. But that was farther in 1 hour than a covered wagon could go in a day. So every year more and more miles of track were laid. But there was even talk of building a railroad that would go all the way across our country to California. But most people said that was nonsense. Buffaloes would block the way. Indians would attack. And what about the high mountains and the desert? Why, you couldn't lay track there. Abraham Lincoln thought differently. After he was made president, he signed a paper that said a Transcontinental Railroad was to be started. Now, the word trans means across, so transcontinental means across the whole width of our country, across the continent. Two companies were to build the railroad. One company was to start building west from the Missouri River. The other company was to start building east from California. When the two tracks met, the railway would be done. Most of the men who started work at the Missouri River had come to this country from Ireland. Most of the men who started work in California came from a very different part of the world. They wore loose blue suits and straw hats. They had pigtails down their backs. They came from the great land of China. Now, a boy named Mike and his father had come from Ireland. After Mike's mother had died, his father had sold their farm in Ireland, and he got just enough money to bring the two of them to America. Now they were working on the railroad. Mike's father was boss of his rail gang. Mike himself was a water boy. He carried water to the thirsty men. Mike's hair was red. His eyes were as blue as the lakes in Ireland. But now his eyes were frowning, and they looked dark as thunderclouds. He had carried so much water that his back ached and his hands hurt. He set his pails down for a minute to rest. A loud, angry shout came. "Hi there, boy! Water!" Mike grabbed up his pails. Water was precious in this desert land where the men were working now, so Mike hurried carefully to the men with his pails. Each day, trains brought up supplies. As soon as new tracks were laid, the engines began running over them. Each day the engines could go a little farther before they came to end of track, as the men called it. Sometimes a mile of track was laid in a day, sometimes 2 miles, sometimes even more. The trains brought up railway ties and iron rails, spikes and bolts. They brought up all the food for the men and hay for the horses. Now, end of track was in the desert, and the train had to bring water as well. The air was always full of noise. Wagons pounded past, men shouted, hammers clanged as the men drove spikes in. Oh, suddenly there was another sound. It was right behind Mike. It was the thud of hoofs. There was a shout, and Mike jumped aside. A big horse went galloping by. A boy rode on the horse's back, and he was shouting at people to get out of the way. The horse galloped down the track. Behind the horse was a long rope fastened to a rail truck that was bringing up more rails for the men at end of track. Mike watched the horse. Oh, how Mike longed to ride such an animal. Oh, but there was no horse for Mike. On he plodded down the path with his pails. Now the day's work was nearly done. No more water was needed. Mike went over to watch his father's gang before they stopped work. There were a few more rails to lay. The men worked fast. It took just half a minute to lay a rail. 2 rails a minute. The end of track moved forward. Nearer and nearer together came the 2 lines of track. Now, A race began between the Irish and the Chinese workers to see who could lay the most track in a day. Oh, the men were eager and excited. The Irish worked hard to beat the Chinese. The Chinese worked hard to beat the Irish. The Irish had done their share of hard work. They had laid track over mountains and across the desert under burning sun. They had had to fight Indians. Oh, but the Chinese, too, had had their share of hardship. Why, in the mountains they had to cross, there were some places where the cliffs dropped straight down for 2,000 feet. There was no place for track. A shelf had to be cut into the side of the mountain. The Chinese workers were let down by ropes. There they hung over the cliffs. They chipped the rock away by hand. Oh, what would happen if the ropes broke? But that was not all. The Chinese had cut tunnels through the mountains. They had blasted away the rock with gunpowder, and that was very dangerous. The men had to light the gunpowder and then run. Sometimes they could not run fast enough. Mike wondered about these Chinese. They were strangers. They were different. He wasn't sure he liked them. Once Mike had seen some of them driving a supply wagon. A boy about his own age was in the wagon. The Irish boys had laughed at the Chinese boy. They'd pointed at his straw hat and his pigtail. But the Chinese boy had paid no attention to them. At last, news came that made every Irishman sit up. Each day, the workers on both sides had been trying to lay a little more track than the day before. Now came news. The Chinese had laid 6 miles of track in one day. Never had there been such a record. Oh, Mike heard the men around him mutter, "We'll show them." Never had the work gone so quickly as it did the next day. Rail trucks thundered along, hammers clanged. Mike raced back and forth with his water buckets. During the day, word came in. 4 miles had been finished, then 5 miles, then 6. Oh, everyone cheered. They would break the record the Chinese had set. Then something unexpected happened. Mike was hurrying along the path. A rail truck came pounding down the track. The big horse was galloping by. Suddenly, the animal stumbled, and the boy riding him went flying over the horse's head. The boy lay on the ground, and the horse stopped. Mike ran to the boy and knelt beside him. He asked if the boy was badly hurt. The boy opened his eyes. Then he began to shout at Mike to get on with the load of rails. The rails must get on to the end of track, and quickly. For half a second, Mike looked at the boy. Then he grinned, his eyes flashed blue, and in a second he was on the horse. "Giddy up!" shouted Mike. And the horse broke into a gallop. Mike bounced up and down. First he thought he'd be bounced to bits, but he held on for dear life. Down the track galloped the horse with the truck following along behind. The men who were waiting were angry. They did not look to see who was on the horse. One worker shouted, "Where have you been, boy?" Mike had no time to explain. He just stopped his horse fast. Then Mike's father saw who was riding the horse, and he shouted to his son, "Good work! Keep those rails a-comin'." When the truck was empty, back down the path rode Mike. He bounced about less now. He was getting used to the horse, and for the rest of the day, Mike rode proudly back and forth along the track. That night, there was good news. 7.5 miles of track had been laid. Oh, there were cheers and celebrations. But not for long. Word came from the other side. The Chinese boasted that the next day they would lay 10 miles of track. 10 miles in one day. Impossible. The railway was nearly finished now. The tracks were coming very close together. In fact, they were so close, it was decided to give the Irish workers a holiday to go to see the fun. 10 miles in a day? Impossible. Mike was up before daybreak. He rode across the desert with his father and a group of the other men in a big wagon. At 7 o'clock, the signal for the Chinese to start work was given. Mike's eyes opened wide. Never had he seen men work so fast. 15 seconds and a rail was down. By noon, 6 miles were down. By 7 o'clock that night, 10 miles were done. The Irish went grumbling back to their camp. The record was broken. And what was worse, there was nothing they could do about it. The railway was too nearly finished. There were only 6 miles of track left to be laid. Oh, Mike muttered to himself that it wasn't fair. He was sure the Irish could have beaten the Chinese if they'd only had the chance. He almost hated those Chinese. There was a great celebration when the last rails were laid on May 10th, 1869. The place where the two tracks met was in the state of Utah, near the Great Salt Lake. Trains came up on the tracks from both directions. They brought crowds of men in high silk hats. They brought ladies in long silk dresses. There were people from every part of our country. At last, everything was ready. 2 engines stood facing each other. Then, the last pair of rails was laid between them. A band played. There were speeches. Then, a gentleman lifted a big hammer. He drove in the last spike in the Transcontinental Railroad, and that spike was made of pure gold. The 2 engines steamed forward until they touched. The people clapped and shouted and threw their caps into the air. The whistles on the engines blew until Mike thought his ears would burst. Bells began to ring. Men fired their guns into the air. Oh, Mike was screaming as loud as anyone. He was jumping up and down. Suddenly, he saw that he was beside the Chinese boy. Mike forgot that he did not like the Chinese. Before he knew it, the 2 were clapping each other on the back. They were laughing and shouting together. The 2 boys could not talk together, but they grinned. They were no longer 2 strangers from 2 very different lands. They had both worked on the great Transcontinental Railroad. They were both Americans. And that was the story of the Transcontinental Railroad from this book, Pioneer Children of America by Carolyn Emerson. Little by little, our country changed from a land of covered wagons and log cabins to one of factories and railways and machinery. It's not, however, the factories and the engines that make a country great. It's the people who live and work there. And men and women and children from almost every land in the world have helped to make this country what it is today. You are going to go right on finding new ways to make it even better. I count on that. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.